Hey y'all, we're going to take our video notes today. This is obviously kind of different from what I've typically done with you guys when it comes to taking notes, simply just because it's coming in a video fashion rather than from me in person. Um, but the expectations in terms of how you're keeping track of your notes on your handouts is very similar. As I go through and I tackle some of these pieces and explain some of the vocabulary to you, expectation is going to be that you're also providing connections to your own experiences and parts of your personality to try to help you guys better make connections to the content. So let's get started with talking about what Freud perceived to be the be-all, end-all to personality. First and foremost, we got to talk about what personality means. If you look at what we, within the field of psychology, use to describe that term, we think that it's a relatively stable pattern of actions. So it's certainly going to be something that makes you unique, but when we say that it's relatively stable, we perceive personality to be pretty unchanging regardless of situations. We've talked about it before that situations can often influence your actions. I've said it to you on numerous occasions that when you're in class with me, that's not necessarily what you truly are in terms of your personality. Some of you guys are far more quiet in class than you are outside of it. Some of you, on the other hand, though, you're pretty chatty with me and you're pretty chatty outside of the building. And so I would argue that's far more an indication of the typical personality that you have because, regardless of that situation, you are operating on fairly stable behavioral patterns. Okay, you're talkative, you're outgoing, you're sociable in those situations, right? And since personality is all about how we all have these things that characterize us as individuals, whether it be the different kinds of emotions that we express and how we go about expressing them, the thoughts and the beliefs that we have, and the ways with which we've developed them, that is what personality is. Now, every perspective that we're going to talk about this unit has a different way of explaining personality and how we developed it. But from the sense of our intro into this unit, we're going to tackle psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theory. So this video obviously is going to be about Freud and then those that have similar ideologies to him. So I'm going to move my video up here a bit just so that way it's a little easier for y'all to see the words that are on this slide. Remember that for psychodynamic and psychoanalytic perspective, everything is all about your unconscious mind. All of the conflicting forces that go on in the unconscious, 80% of your brain, that guide our behaviors in ways that we just aren't aware from those kind of unconscious sexual and aggressive urges. Remember that Freud also very heavily leaned on the explanation of early childhood trauma to explain how it is that we develop our personality, particularly as adults. He felt that when we have certain traumatic and life-altering experiences when we're young, those can produce unconscious thoughts and feelings that ultimately, through ways that we're not aware that they're doing, create habits and conflict. And in many respects, they can create self-defeating behaviors. If you think back to, for example, the scenario that I've often shared with you guys about me and how when I was in the earlier portions of my adult personality, I just don't do conflict in my personal life simply just because I saw so much of it with my parents when I was young because they divorced and they fought a lot. And realistically, that's very self-defeating. When someone upsets me or hurts my feelings, I need to voice those behaviors and make them aware of what's happening. But my choices in those circumstances was to simply just take how that affected me and shove it further and further down and to not acknowledge it in any way. And so when we talk about that concept of self-defeating, that's an important thing for you to recognize. You're going to hear me reference self-defeating again when we come up on defense mechanisms a little later on in the video. But for right now, just recognize for yourself, and you can put this off into the margins or star it, that when we're referencing self-defeating behaviors, what we often look at is actions that we take due to those unconscious forces that can end up hurting us in the long run and being problematic for us as adults. Remember that Freud is the guy that is all about psychoanalysis and identifying what's in the unconscious, because he's the guy that created this whole theory. Your unconscious is this storehouse for emotions and thoughts and feelings and memories that are, for the most part, pretty illogical. They don't make sense. They're not rooted in rational thought processing, and it will end up impacting how you act in your full level of consciousness. Remember, we've had numerous conversations since we started this course about how many of you guys have found yourselves in situations where you acted what perceived on impulse, when what Freud would say was, nope, that was simply just your unconscious mind guiding your actions in ways that you just didn't understand at that point, right? So, traumatic events from your childhood force those thoughts and emotions into the unconscious. And so what your goal of psychoanalytic perspective is then is to tap into those unconscious forces, bring them about to the conscious mind, and you do that through free association, which we did a little demo of with one another in class back in Unit 1. So this is where things are going to take a little bit of a weird turn. It's not very often that teachers have to videotape themselves talking about a person's sexual energy, but that is just where we find ourselves today. So, Freud believed that you develop over your, for all intents and purposes, your childhood, pretty much, just because even into teenage years, you're still pretty childlike in many respects, as we all know. So we're going to be spending a lot of emphasis in this portion of things looking at early development, okay? And so we go through different stages. He called these the psychosexual stages, where we have libido. This is a term that many of you guys have probably heard of before, just in a very different context. But your libido is your sexual energy. And it's going to take different forms as you grow and develop within the various stages of that development itself. At each stage, there's going to be a certain amount of conflict or anxiety or frustration that you in that developmental stage must resolve in order to develop normally. Okay, so if you're able to resolve that conflict, you will develop perfectly fine and you'll have no hang-ups or issues. But if your normal psychosexual development is blocked or stunted in any way, we call that technically fixation, you're going to end up continuing to be preoccupied with the pleasure-seeking area of that stage's psychosexual development. I'm sure that you're sitting there thinking right now that this is kind of weird stuff to be talking about, and you're totally right. And many of you guys are probably also sitting there thinking there's no way that this could actually apply to you in any way. But believe it or not, an awful lot of what Freud emphasized within these stages very much carries over into you, and so that's what we're going to evaluate as we move through each one of these psychosexual stages. So let's talk about the oral stage, okay? Yes, things are going to be very weird as we move through these stages. It's okay to giggle and laugh. Just, try to temper it a little bit for me, okay? So the oral stage of psychosexual development. What is this one all about? Clearly, you obtain pleasure from the mouth, predominantly via biting, sucking, gnawing on things, chewing on things. Now, here's the thing. If you think about it in a logical sense, remember, Freud is very much about illogical, but just bear with me here. Look at the age range for the oral stage of your development. It's from the time you're born till you're roughly a year old. Think about when you were a baby, or any of the babies you've ever babysat, or any little cousins, or siblings, or even nieces and nephews that you've interacted with. I know y'all can understand from my perspective of having two little ones myself. At this age, all a baby does is just take stuff and immediately chew on it. There have been numerous times when we've had to make sure that there are things, cords that are not around for my kids to be able to try to, when they were little, grab their mouth and just go to town on it. If you give a baby a toy, they're immediately going to put it into their mouth. And that's part of their way of interacting with the world and seeing how things work, looking at the taste of something, the texture of things, stuff like that. So it does kind of make sense that Freud focused so significantly in this particular area within the oral stage of psychosexual development. Now here's the deal. If you're fixated at this stage, what you're going to do is you're going to seek out oral gratification. You're going to overeat. Okay, so Freud would essentially look at circumstances with regard to obesity as an oral fixation, believe it or not. Smoking. Not to get too far into your illegal activities, because you can't smoke any longer until you're 21, and you certainly can't smoke other things recreationally. Please do me a solid, and if that does actually apply to you, don't write that down. Pick something that's a little bit more scholastically appropriate for our purposes, because I just don't want to know what you're doing illegally. It's kind of awkward for you and for me. Drinking, same thing. Please don't share your extracurricular activities for the weekend. But Freud would absolutely argue that alcoholism, or somebody who enjoys it a little too much, is definitely stunted in the oral stage of their fixated energies for the libido. He would also argue that those that are very clingy and dependent, so somebody that who, once they're in a relationship with an individual, is just so all consumed with that person that is all that they spend their time focusing in on, that would also be something that he would emphasize presents itself here. Other examples of oral gratification, because I'm sure you're sitting there thinking as you're listening to this and you're trying to wrap your brains around all of this and stop giggling. Well, if I'm not allowed to talk about my inappropriate scholastic extracurriculars, then what am I supposed to talk about? Well, I guarantee that there are quite a lot of you guys that are nail biters, because you would be applicable to this with regard to oral gratification and fixation in this stage. People that chew on pen caps or your water bottle caps. People who constantly chew gum. All of you, actually, believe it or not, have yourselves stunted in this stage of your psychosexual development. So I'll out myself here. I'll join the many of you that actually have this apply to you. I always chew gum. Always, always, always. It's part of something that I've just always felt a necessity to do, and especially since I became a teacher, because, no offense, y'all are super judgy, and it just wouldn't be good for me if I'm sitting there talking to a kid and I got coffee breath, because then all they're going to do is just, post that all over the various different forms of social media about how Miss H has like hardcore nasty coffee breath. So I chew gum constantly, all the time, and I have it in various random places. So, for example, I have right here one of my bags of Eclipse gum. It's one of the ginormous, great way to refill 180 pieces bags. Okay, so Freud would argue I was stunted in my oral stage of psychosexual development, and so that has impacted me in terms of some of the behaviors that I operate on as an adult. Now, you have been asked on your sheet of paper to identify how this applies to you. Even if you didn't find yourself stunted in any of those stages, this stuff does still apply, because what you have the ability to say then is, hey, I have developed normally, I resolved my libido in that stage of my psychosexual development, and I'm good. Is it fun maybe to identify it for other people in your life? Sure, you could do that too. You could talk, maybe you have a parent who's a smoker. You could say that Freud would explain this in terms of their personality. Now, do me a solid, don't go home telling your parents, like, hey, you were stunted in the oral stage of your psychosexual development, unless you're going to give them some context to why it is that you're coming home and saying that to them, because I don't know that that would go over very well. So once you've gotten that part down, perfectly okay for you to pause me at this point, by the way, because I know that I'm moving through this pretty quickly, and that's the nice thing about video notes, is it's easy for you to stop and start as we go. Let's talk about stage 2, which is the anal stage of your psychosexual development. Yes, you heard that right. Wait till you get to the phrasings that we use for people who are fixated in this stage. What's going on here? Well, from the ripe old age of 1 to 3, you obtain pleasure by learning to control your bodily wastes. That's right, kids. Again, try to control your laughter. Let's try to look at this in a logical way. Okay, because for many of us, this just seems so far out there. But remember, it is the unconscious, and you just don't realize that these things are guiding your behavior. Even if you look at it from a logical lens and evaluate Freud's ideology from that way, think about so much of what is emphasized with little kids at this age. It is learning how to control their need to go to the bathroom. We've potty trained my daughter. My daughter is 3.5. She was fully potty trained by the time that she was 20. Well, no, she was about 3. Just a shade over the age of 3, because she had to be fully potty trained in order to go to preschool. And so she, even before we started really emphasizing potty training for her, she was the one who wanted to be able to do it. And she felt super duper proud of herself for being able to let us know when she needed to go potty and to not go into her diaper. And certainly there were things that we did to try to encourage that. However, Freud would look to this behavior and say, hey, this is the reason why children try to do this. Now, if you resolve normally in this stage, you're basically going to be a nice little, what we would refer to as an in-betweeny weenie when it comes to certain demonstration of your characteristics of behavior, personality-wise. In order to explain where you would fall in that, let me talk about the extremes here, okay? Because that was the big emphasis that Freud had. If you're fixated in this stage, one of two ways this is going to go. You could become what we call anal retentive, and you actually hear this phrase very commonly still today. It's very heavily used. Most people just have shortened it to being retentive, or kind of colloquially, or informally, you hear people just referred to as being really anal or uptight. But anal retentive is when people are just so obsessed with neatness and order. It is like the guiding principle to their actions. Everything has to be organized, color-coded. In its proper place, all right angles on a desk, stuff like that. They color code their closets, for example. Their binders are all organized and color coded that way too. So all of those things are there, present in their personalities because they are operating from this perspective according to Freud. Now, when you go to the opposite end of that, you have what we call anal expulsive, which is a really not pleasant word. But anal expulsive is the complete opposite. And many of you guys, I know you're in this boat because I've seen your level of organization because you haven't even gotten your materials for our materials check yet. So in this circumstance, what we're looking at is something called, the level of organization where it looks like a bomb blew up in your book bag. You're like ripping out pieces of paper that have been crumbled and all of those kinds of things. If you have a very messy and disorganized personality, and perhaps you're somebody who's not very good at, controlling your words, for example, so you have what we call lovingly so verbal vomit, you would be down there in that anal expulsive stage of things. So then if you're one of my in-betweeny weenies, what you're going to be is somebody who, like, you're not to one of those extremes or the other. Sometimes you have a tendency to be kind of organized, but then sometimes you can be a little slappy. Like, you're not one end of the spectrum over the other, and so that would ultimately mean that you're relatively balanced, and so as such you have the ability to have resolved that libido from that stage. Okay, so again, how does this apply to you? Do you know people in your life that are anal retentive? Are you anal retentive? Do you know individuals that have anal expulsive tendencies? Are you an in-betweeny weenie? Where would this apply for you? Put that down in your notes right now. Feel free to pause me while you do it. And then you'll want to move on to stage 3, which is right here. I don't know why my numbers are so off, but they are. Let's talk about the phallic stage. Phallic stage is stage 3. This was one of the highly significant stages to Freud. As a matter of fact, he believed that this was the most significant stage. And if you thought it couldn't get any more weird with what I'm teaching you today, prepare yourselves. It's going to get even more strange now. We've heard me make reference a little bit to this, to the Oedipal and electric complexes, but we're going to get a little more in depth on them right now. So the phallic stage is where children start to finally become curious about their genitalia. And if you try to think about it in a logical fashion, to some extent it makes sense if you've ever babysat little kids that are in this age range, or you have little siblings or stuff like that, they do seem to, be very interested in their body parts down there. And so, essentially Freud used this as a means of explaining that kind of aspect of things. Here's where things take an even more strange turn. He felt that not only are you going to be preoccupied with your genitalia, but you're also going to be dealing with an unconscious attraction, romantically so, to your opposite sex parent. So he titled this the Oedipus complex. This is for boys who have attachments to their moms, okay, and they have hostility toward dad. So essentially this is his way of explaining mama's boys. Okay, now daughter Anna came along, as did a psychodynamic colleague named Karen Horney, who created the Electra complex, because Freud never really emphasized this in any respects toward girls, and so to kind of equalize this out and include equality amongst the genders, these ladies created the Electra complex, which is essentially the opposite. So when little girls have unconscious romantic attachment toward dad, they have hostility toward mom. So this is essentially a way of explaining daddy's girls. Now, how did these names come about? Oedipus is a Greek mythological character who, unbeknownst to him, ended up falling in love with the woman who ended up becoming his mother. He was adopted. He was abandoned when he was born, adopted into a family that was not biologically his. And so when he went out on an odyssey, per much of Greek mythology for typical men at that time, he fell in love with a woman of a different kingdom who ended up being his mother. And so, not to get too far into Greek tragedy, that is essentially how this phrase got its naming. Now, if you are fixated in this stage, gentlemen, you fear castration. You are essentially afraid that you will lose the symbol of your manhood. And ladies, you develop what they call as penis envy. You wish you had the male genitalia. Now, lots of questions arise from this stage when kids are viewing this content, and typically I am there with you guys to be able to clarify it for you. So don't be worried if you have some questions or concerned about this stage, because once I'm back with y'all, I'll be able to talk about it a little bit more in depth with you to clarify it. Because a lot of times kids, what they want to know is, well, what if I'm a kid who's a dude and I'm really close to my dad? Or, well, I'm a girl and I'm really close to my mom. What happened there? Ultimately, what happens is, and I can elaborate on this for you more later when I come back, but we see something called identification in the latter half of this stage, which is right around the age of 5, where a kid starts to realize, quote unquote, realize, unconsciously so, that it's not socially acceptable for them to have romantic feelings towards their opposite sex parent. And so what they try to do is they then unconsciously behave as if they are that same sex parent. So mom starts to be emulated an awful lot more by a daughter. So a girl's going to walk around wearing dress-ups, mom's clothes, wear her makeup, walk around, try to act like her. Little boys are going to start trying to imitate dad. They'll, put on tool belts, or they'll walk around and try to act like dad and behave like him. And so that's how that would be applicable for you. Now, if you find yourself in a circumstance where you're having a difficulty being able to identify the connection for this for yourself, don't worry. Like I said, I'll come back. I'll be back with you guys not too shortly, and then I'll be able to clarify it for you. But I do think that realistically, there is someone in your life, if not you, because some of you guys acknowledged to me in class if you were mama's boys or daddy's girls. I acknowledged that I was a daddy's girl, so Freud would say I was stunted in this phase of my psychosexual development as well. And so, I'm sure that there can be, even if it's not you definitively, there is some way to be able to identify the presence of a fixation behavior from this stage in your life in some way. So I'd like you to at least try to do that for me right now. And then once you've identified that, obviously, again, feel free to pause it for yourself. Let's tackle these final 2 stages. Stage 4 is what we call the latent stage. Do me a solid. On your notes, just above latent, put in parentheses that this means hidden. So latent stage is where you hide or you suppress sexual interest in the opposite sex. And so what happens is kids want to just play with predominantly same-sex peers. Welcome to why, essentially, kids think about cooties. If you think about this age, girls play with girls, boys play with boys. I mean, stereotypically, you'd see this all the time in, middle school dances and stuff. It always seems like girls are always over on this side of the room and boys are over on this side of the room, and everybody just awkwardly stares at one another. And so Freud would essentially believe that this is the prevalence of things all the way up through into, early junior high. And then you move down into the genital stage. Now you want to be careful because this stage is called the genital stage, but it doesn't have anything to do with genitalia. And so a lot of times kids can get the genital and the phallic stage confused. So you're going to want to make sure that you point out for yourself in some way on your notes that the genital stage is a part of your development where you have officially reached adult sexuality, which is essentially puberty and up. So you guys are in the genital stage of your psychosexual development at this point, okay? Here's the problem. Freud would argue that if you were ever stunted in any of the earlier stages of psychosexual development, in the oral or the anal or the phallic stage, there is no ability for you to have energy left for this stage, and so you're going to have a very unsatisfied love life as an adult. Now, a lot of times when I say that to kids, they start to giggle and they think it sounds really silly and that it all deals with sex because, hey, what about this doesn't revolve around sex from Freud's perspective? But I'm going to emphasize to you something a little bit more here, that it's not just that. Think about the people who always seem to have one foot out the door when it comes to a relationship, or they're not willing to open up emotionally, or they always seem to be, someone that's just very superficial with regard to their relationships. If you know someone who's like that, or you yourself are like that, or you've dated somebody who is like that, well, voila, here is your personal connection for things. Because that's what Freud is emphasizing with regard to the lack of a satisfying love life. You can't commit, you can't put yourself into a committed relationship or have the energy level to have a successful relationship in those circumstances because your psychosexual libido was stunted in those earlier stages. So how would stages 4 and 5 here, latent and genital, apply to you? Do they? Did you ever seem to have issues with cooties where you thought boys were really gross or girls were gross? Do you have little siblings that seem to be in this stage right now, or cousins or nieces and nephews that were there? What about the genital stage? For many of you guys, you're going to have to talk about the fact that you're going to, in terms of your genital stage connection, if you were stunted earlier, you're going to have a very unsatisfying love life. And so for me, this is going to be a really interesting circumstance with regard to my future, since, according to this theory, I'm in big trouble. But nevertheless, you can't tell me that as we've gone through this, despite how weird and strange it is, that there isn't some connective value to it with regard to parts of you and how you operate or people that you know in your life. So once you've gotten down your personal connection to the genital stage and the latent stage, we're going to move on to the last piece that I'm going to ask you guys to tackle for me today, which is the structures of personality. Okay? Here's the rub. Freud believed that every person has essentially 3 parts to their personality. Now, you know that he's all about the unconscious mind. Where things can get a little dicey for kids is that there is one part of this personality triad, as it were, that is partially conscious. And so that can make things a little confusing for kids. But we're going to try and make sure that we kind of decode this for you, essentially, okay? So let's talk about these 3 structures. I'm going to start with this guy. We pronounce it the id. It's not ID, okay? It's not like your state ID or anything like that. Then you have, I'm going to come down here to superego, and then I'm going to talk about ego, okay? So you're going to want to get out some of the kind of preconceived, conditioned notions you have towards some of these words because they're not going to connect with how you've heard them in other contexts. So let's talk about the id. The id is your biological drives and demands. It operates on what we call the pleasure principle of I want what I want, when I want it, and I want it now. So it's a very immediate gratification piece. Many would argue that you guys in particular are very prone toward operating on the id. In many respects you are. I've seen you guys do this in class. I've never given you permission to eat in my classroom. But it hasn't stopped an awful lot of y'all from just, as you're sitting there at your seat, pulling out some food and just going to town on me, even though I've never given you the okay that. Now, other things to keep in mind for it are when you're tired and you're super sleepy in class, you do, well, if you feel really tired, you're going to just conk out and put your head down and fall asleep. Okay? So, when we're talking about this, I want what I want when I want it circumstance, that's what we're looking at. Okay? Now, if we flip it down, so if you think of the id kind of like a devil on your shoulder, if you drew like a little devil face with like devil horns and stuff like that next to this one, I think that would do a really good job of helping you to identify how this guy works. Because he's definitely you giving into your baser instincts or your baser desires. Because a lot of times these can be very much that biological instinctual thing. Superego, on the other hand, is going to represent your morality, okay? So your sense of right versus wrong, good versus bad. This is going to be essentially the little angel on your shoulder, okay? He's the guy that oftentimes is going to check that id, okay? So, for example, if we were to give that food scenario, the superego would pop out and they would say, like, yo, she never said it was okay for you to eat in her room. Like, maybe you should have asked if it was okay before you started doing that, because that's kind of rude to just take out food and just start eating without getting her permission to do so, right? And so it would be the superego that would be doing that for you. Ego. Your ego in this circumstance doesn't mean, because a lot of times when y'all have heard of the word ego, you think like somebody who's real self-centered or full of themselves or something like that. That's not even remotely close to what we're talking about with this term. Your ego is the guy that has to compromise between its demands and superego's constraints. Okay? So that's why he operates on what we call the reality principle. He has to be some kind of rational, thoughtful decision maker. And so your ego is actually a largely conscious component of your personality. Superego and id, not so much. They're more unconscious. Okay, so if you write that down for yourself, that could also be helpful. Okay, so if you got like id is unconscious, ego is conscious, and then superego is unconscious, then that might be kind of helpful. So let's talk about an example here for structures of personality, because you guys, as part of your exit slip for the end of all of this, you've got to show me that you understand how this stuff works. And so you're going to have to create your own personal example from this, and it cannot be this slide. Ha ha, ha 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 ha, ha ha, ha. You have to show me you understand how these structures work. So you've got to come up with something totally different in terms of how the id, ego, and superego interact in you. Okay? So let me do another demo here for you, another example to get your brain wrapped around what you could do moving forward. Okay? So we're going to stick with food because y'all are teenagers. And so sometimes that has a tendency to be very impactful with regard to your actions, right? So let's say it's the end of this day. For my 7th belt peeps, that won't be terribly hard, simply just because, you know, it is literally the end of the day. So you are on your way out to the parking lot, busting tail to get there because, you know, heaven forbid that you get there past 2:48, because then you're taking your life in your hands with how y'all like try to drive in that parking lot. And you start to feel yourself getting super, 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 super hungry. Id is sitting there saying like, yo, you're going to go driving past all kinds of good stuff on Glenway. You got Chick-fil-A. You got, dude, IHOP. Like, oh, get yourself some like really yum pancakes or something like that. I don't know. Okay, but your id is going to be sitting there like, yo, you are super duper hungry. You should just go through a drive-through and get this satisfied now. Here's the problem. What complicates this is superego is sitting there telling you, hey, here's the problem. Your mom or grandma or aunt or whomever, think of the best cook in your house, even dad, because my husband's a phenomenal cook. Okay, so dad, grandpa, uncle, aunt, whomever, think of the best cook in your family. You're going to their house, and they're going to be making your absolute favorite food that they make. Okay, so let's say that it's like a lasagna, and they're going to be making this from scratch. They make their own sauce. I mean, like, you're talking like a hardcore kind of circumstance, right? And so if they're putting all this level of effort into that, here comes little superego, our little angel on our shoulder, sitting there saying like, hey, if you do this, you're going to ruin any level of appetite that you've got for that food. And if they've slaved all that time and they put all that energy in there, and you're going to show up totally full because you decided to give in to that hunger and that I want what I want when I want it now kind of thing, like, you're going to hurt their feelings, and that's just not right. That's really kind of rude, because, you know, that darn superego is always all about making sure you're not being rude and following morals, right? So then it's the ego's job to come in and say, okay, we have to resolve this. I got to give something to my id, and I got to give something to my superego, because that's one of the biggest things that kids get confused on. They always look at this stuff and they'll think, okay, well, I'm hungry. I want to eat. That's my id. Superego says, hey, no, that's not okay. My ego just says go with the id. You can't do that. That's not how the personality works. There has to be some kind of compromise. So the id gets a little, and then the superego gets a little. And that scenario that I just gave there, where you just give in and you eat a whole bunch of stuff on Glenway, like there is no compromise. You've just totally given in to your id's demands there. So you have to do something. So what could you do? Ego comes in and says, have a bag of chips. Run back in, because you know y'all are going to be sitting in the parking lot anyway until at least 3:15 with regard to how, organized everything is with trying to get out, and all you do is just sit there anyway. Run back in, hit the commons, go to one of the vending machines, get yourself a bag of chips, run back out to your car, and then everybody's happy. You haven't ruined your appetite for that amazing homemade lasagna that your family member has cooked over for like hours and hours on end. And you're not just starving your id, you're still giving them a little something with regard to at least taking off the edge with regard to your hunger. And so everybody ends up happy that way. So this is going to be where I'm going to leave this video. We're not going to tackle defense mechanisms yet. We can get to those later, okay? This needs to be the primary focus. I need to see that you understand how these pieces work before I can tackle defense mechanisms and the remainder of psychodynamic theory. So this is where you guys are going to leave off for me to give you some more reflection, as it were, with regard to structures of personality for some stuff that you guys more easily understand or recognize. I need you to tell me from your own experiences. You have a space on your piece of notes that asks you to come up with your own personal example of the id, ego, and superego interacting with one another at some time in some kind of experience for you. And so that's what you guys are going to do for me as your exit slip. And you should have plenty of time because, I haven't taken up the whole bell talking to you guys on this video. So that's what you need to do. And it can be to anything. It can be for academics. It can be for school. It can be with your friends. It can be for sports. Any number of things out there. But I need to see that you understand how all of this stuff works. Because then what you're going to do for me is you're going to turn in your notes packet. You're going to make sure your name is on it, and then when I come back, I'm going to be taking a look at these to see, do you essentially understand how this stuff works? So then that way, if you don't, I can make sure that I go back and reteach it to you accordingly to ensure that you understand it. Okay? So this has been a very eventful video that you've watched. I'm sure you were not planning on having to discuss any of this stuff or learn about it today. But hopefully you found it relatively engaging. Not many kids that I know of that sit there and have to acknowledge themselves as being anal expulsive in a day. But obviously when I come back, if you've got any questions, or even while I'm gone, if you want to email me, you're more than welcome to. But I will see you guys soon. Just make sure that you get those structures of personality examples in, and we'll be good to go.